So since we're bringing together all these different perspectives on Iraqi Jews and modernity in the late Ottoman era, I thought it would be helpful to just kind of put it up there and frame it. So of course, when we're talking about modernity, we're covering a vast range of experience, right? And we can approach the study of modernity from so many different standpoints as we've been doing today: political, economic, looking at technology, society, culture, leisure practices, everything we've been discussing. And in fact, all these different facets intersected and overlapped, obviously. I mean, the leisure is also economic, and economics are also political. But in scholarship, sometimes we kind of frame it separately. So I mention this because although my work is focusing on cultural modernity, mainly through print culture, and even more specifically through literature and the modernizing projects known as the Arabic Nahda and the Hebrew Haskalah, it's all interconnected, right? And so when we're looking at Iraqi Jewish modernity in the late Ottoman period, for a comprehensive picture, we also need to consider not only the ways that the different structural aspects intersect, but also in terms of what Annie was referring to as multiple affiliations, how those frames intersect. So we're looking at the Ottoman, the Arab, Jewish, and European cultural and political contexts, right? And so my talk today focuses on an aspect of literary translation, which was a very important facet of these modernizing movements of the Nahda and the Haskalah. And Yuval's also going to be discussing translation, so we should be able to make some interesting connections in the discussion. Now, in some of my earlier research, I focused on Arab Jews in the Nahda who wrote in Fusha, or Standard Arabic. Okay, and so part of what I want to do in setting this up is to explain the distinctions in terms of not just the language, but the audience and the goals of Jewish writers and translators in this period who were working in Standard Arabic, Fusha, as opposed to Judeo-Arabic. So Jewish writers of Fusha, in terms of their network, they tended to be part of the Effendiya, which was a new class of bourgeois professionals. So they were part of these professional and social networks that included leading Muslim and Christian intellectuals. And often they were graduates of the new types of secular educational institutions that Orit mentioned, things like the new law colleges or schools like the Alliance. And their publications, including their literary translations, they were intended for a wide audience. They weren't usually tailored to Jewish readers, with a few exceptions. And so, when they're writing in Fusha, they sound very similar to Christian and Muslim writers, and culturally, their language is more Islamic, in terms of the references that they use. And most of their literary translations were done from the French. Okay, so in terms of strictly literary translations, they were translating French novels and plays. Now, today I'm going to be discussing a complementary phenomenon of Judeo-Arabic literary translation, and this is different. Judeo-Arabic, just in case you don't know, it's Arabic written in Hebrew characters, but now it's explicitly intended for Jewish readers, so it has a different place in this composite picture of Iraqi Jewish modernity, and more broadly even Arab Jewish cultural modernity. So in the case that I'm talking about today, the translator in question, who was based in Calcutta, and we'll be discussing the Indian context, he's a rabbi and part of a transnational network of Jewish intellectuals who are engaged in the Haskalah movement, okay, the Jewish Enlightenment. And his translation activity was conducted directly from prior Hebrew translations. So basically now we're talking about the kind of transnational Jewish cultural sphere extending to Europe proper, and about literary circulation between Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Iraqi Jews, and in this case, Iraqi Jews in India. During the 19th century, which is the time of all of this, the period of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, and the Nahda, or modern Arab Renaissance, Iraqi Jews began engaging in the Hebrew-based Haskalah project, but with their own specifically Iraqi and Ottoman viewpoints, as Annie Green has also shown us in her work. During this time period, there is also a general renaissance of Judeo-Arabic print culture. Until the 20th century, Judeo-Arabic folk literature constituted the large part of the secular Jewish writing that was published in the East. And we find in Judeo-Arabic an enormous body of original folk literature, didactic writings, and then from the end of the 19th century, then we start to get these translated literatures from Hebrew, from Standard Arabic, from Fusha, from Ladino, from European languages, and actually even from Yiddish. Both Yiddish and Ladino literatures have already been studied seriously as historical sources for understanding the emergence of Jewish cultural modernity among their respective publics. And when we look at that, the emphasis usually is on the interplay of literature and ideology, because these literary projects were undertaken basically in the service of, modernizing the public. The translators had these ideological goals and tended to be very didactic. But Judeo-Arabic literary translation has not really received scholarly attention from historians or literary scholars. And so I'm hoping to fill in that gap with my future work. And I'm just in very, very preliminary stages, so I'm essentially just giving you some outlines today. So today I'll be introducing you to the literary translations of Shlomo Twaina, who's the owner and operator of the Calcutta Hebrew Press and the leading force behind the early 20th century literary translations into Judeo-Arabic. Twaina was born in Baghdad in 1855 and sent to Bombay in 1880 as a rabbi for the expat merchant Baghdadi community there. And he resettles in Calcutta, where he founds this Hebrew press. And there at his press, he printed 71 books in Judeo-Arabic, all of which he wrote, edited, or translated. And he also printed this weekly Judeo-Arabic newspaper called Magid Misharim, which ran from 1890 to 1901. It's like the Speaker of Truth is the title. He died in Calcutta in 1913. Now, Magid Misharim is part of a much broader story of Jewish printing in India. Iraqi Jews in Bombay and Calcutta printed newspapers in Judeo-Arabic from 1855 until 1902. And the famous business tycoon and philanthropist David Sassoon, we've been hearing a lot about the Sassoons today, and they're central to this story as well. He was instrumental in the publication of the first of these, which was Talib al-Khair lil-Qawmihi, or Doresh Tov la'amo, which was printed in Bombay from 1855 to 1866, and which catered to the community's merchant elite. And this newspaper published local news on Jewish and general affairs, education, and historical essays. And so that was in Bombay, but then that was followed by two Calcutta-based papers, the first one being Hamavasir, which was from 1873 to 1878 or 1879, we're not sure. And then the second one is Perach, which both of these weekly newspapers, Perach followed it, so that was 1878 to 1889. So these newspapers carried local news items and then also translated articles from the Hebrew press. And they did have some original and translated literary works. Now, Magid Misharim, to go back to Twaina, was almost the last of these Judeo-Arabic periodicals of the Iraqi Jews in India. There was just one other called Shoshana that followed it from 1901 to 1902. And it seems that Jewish intellectual life in Calcutta went into decline beginning in the 20th century. And Judeo-Arabic was supplanted by English language periodicals beginning in 1913, which was also the date of Twaina's death. Orit Bashkin contextualizes these India-based Judeo-Arabic newspapers within the colonial British mercantile economy, which we've also just heard a lot about from Zvi. So again, you can see how, like I said, all these aspects of modernity are deeply interconnected. Orit says that it's indicated by items about British commercial interests in India, and I quote, Perach, Talib al-Khair, and Hamavasir included in their opening pages details about the movements of ships to and from Basra, Bombay, Liverpool, London, Rangoon, Shanghai, and Singapore. The importance of local trade was attested by the fact that Ashkenazi Jews bought ads in Perach. So basically, none of these newspapers would have existed in absence of the British imperial trade system. And that's what facilitates, the literary publications. So like its predecessors, Magid Misharim also carried the local news of the Jewish communities in India. And so the first pages were dedicated to announcements of births and deaths and marriages. And it had the aforementioned shipping news and schedules, and then the worldwide Jewish news, mostly translated from other Jewish newspapers. And as Tzvi Yehuda discusses in his recent book, Tweina's reportage in Magid Mesharim focused heavily on the hardships of Jews in Baghdad. So they were very concerned with what was going on at home, right? Such as persecution by the Ottoman authorities and the outbreaks of plague there. But Tweina really, it was important to him to emphasize literature and culture. So he created a separate insert called Magid Mishneh, the supplement of Magid, where he published both short stories that he translated and his own Hebrew sermons in single issues, or if he published longer literary works, he published them in installments over multiple issues. This kind of serialization was like a regular facet of literature in the 19th century. Often, it appeared in the roman feuilleton in this kind of serialized format. So he had numerous literary translations from Hebrew to Judeo-Arabic, and those included recent popular fiction and world classics. And that brings me to what I'm going to be discussing today after I finish with this background. So following his serializations in his newspaper, he would then republish these works as individual volumes, as books. And we can surmise that through his translations, he aimed to expose his audience to European, kind of bourgeois reading practices, which were a major marker of Western cultural modernity. Okay, so now we can talk about the actual works in question. And his three most significant literary translations, at least from my viewpoint, what I'm really interested in are these three in particular: The Mysteries of Paris, which he, or Mystères Paris in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic, which he serialized in Magid Mesharim from September to December of 1890, and then published as a book 6 years later in 1896. The second one is The Veil of Cedars, or in Hebrew, Emek HaArazim, which he serialized in 1892 and 1893 and published as a book in 2 volumes, 1894, 1895. And then finally, Ahavat Zion, which, if you don't know, it's Abraham Mapu's 1853 Love of Zion, often said to be the first modern Hebrew novel. And this was serialized in Magid Mesharim over 8 issues of 1900, and then also published but incompletely as a book in the same year. And incidentally, Ahavat Zion also appeared in Judeo-Arabic in a different translation in Tunisia in 1890 and in Judeo-Persian in 1908, so there was a lot of interest in it. Most of Tweina's other translations were of religious-themed texts, and many of those have already been analyzed by Yitzhak Avishur. But his translations of European and of this kind of new modern Hebrew fiction, like Ahavat Zion, have not been studied. To the best of my knowledge, Judeo-Arabic was not used previously as a language for modern European-style fiction, especially from non-Jewish origins. So what he was doing there was quite innovative, and that's the reason for my interest in it. So let's take a closer look at his translation of The Mysteries of Paris. So what is The Mysteries of Paris? This was a major phenomenon in the 19th century. The Mysteries is a Gothic novel by the French writer Eugène Sue. It was originally published serially in French newspapers between 1842 and 1843 in hundreds of installments. It was massive. The Mysteries quickly made its way into dozens of European languages, becoming, well, I guess there aren't dozens, but multiple. I mean, really, like every European language you can think of, translated it. I mean, Danish, like anything you want. It became an international sensation and one of the best-selling books of all time. When it was finally collected and published as one book, it came in at about 1,500 pages. It's massive. Okay, so the thing to understand when we're talking about translation in this period in the 19th century is we're not always talking about literal translation. More often we're talking about rewritings or adaptations where the different authors who are working in different languages are kind of rewriting, like making their own, but it's just based on the original. So they're drawing inspiration from it. And this was especially the case for the Jewish language work. So they're not literally translating all 1,500 pages of this. So the greatly abridged, much shorter Hebrew version, which I'll talk about Hebrew first, was translated by a maskil named Kalman Schulman, and it was published in Vilna between 1857 to 1860. And this is actually very important for Hebrew literary history as well, because it's one of the first works of European fiction translated into Hebrew. And this has been studied by my colleague Naomi Brenner. It was also then published in Yiddish serially between 1865 and 1866, and in Ladino as Los Misterios de París in 1891, and then Tweena translated it into Judeo-Arabic in 1896 from the Hebrew translation by Kalman Schulman. So what is the essence of the mysteries? This was, again, it was a major phenomenon in the 19th century throughout world literature. But the story basically is, it's this kind of Gothic romance. It takes the reader into the seedy nighttime underworld of Paris. It's set in a tavern frequented by liberated convicts and prostitutes. The central protagonist is a German duke disguised as a Parisian worker who takes up vigilante justice. And he's aided in his mission by an English nobleman and a young ex-slave doctor. And in the meantime, the female heroine is a sex worker named Songbird. So considering all of this, the novel made a very interesting choice for Rav Tweena to translate. But we should also keep in mind that the prior Hebrew translation he was working with was considerably tamer and more chaste than the lurid French original. And the Hebrew also, it's very different than the original. It substitutes, so basically it's this Gothic mystery romance, but there's a lot of ideology in it that is expressing class critique, right? And all of that goes out in the Hebrew. And the Hebrew translation basically turns it into a masculic text. It takes out out goes the class critique, and in goes kind of the ideology of the Haskalah. Okay, and Naomi Brenner discusses this, and also, if you look at the Hebrew version, it has 24 pages in the introduction of endorsements and praise because the Hebrew translator was so worried about how is his audience going to respond to this text because it's so salacious, right? So he had to kind of legitimize it. So by the time Tweena got around to it, it had already been translated into Hebrew, Yiddish, and Ladino, so it was already kosher, so to speak. So his translation just simplifies and abridges the original story. And you have to also keep in mind that Judeo-Arabic and Ladino and Yiddish and Hebrew can't do the things that French and English can do in terms of detail at this point, right? They don't have this long experience of novelistic writing. So they're just trying to give you, kind of the essence of the plot rather than the atmosphere and the cultural detail. And the overall tone and orientation follows the Hebrew version. So let's take a close look at the first page, and we'll start to compare the versions. So as you can see, Tweena used Rashi script in his publications. So as a Baghdadi Jew in colonial India, linguistically, he has Hebrew, classical Arabic, colloquial Iraqi Jewish Arabic, English, Hindi, and traces of the novel's original French. So it's going to be very linguistically mixed. So the novel is, his narrative is written in the Baghdadi Jewish dialect with some little Indian, additions. And it has all of these non-standard spellings and grammatical quirks, and I'll confess that it's really hard. Like not being a native Arabic speaker, let alone a native speaker of Iraqi Jewish dialect, let alone somebody who had time in India, there are things I just couldn't figure out. So I would love if anybody could help me. But one example is this word up here at the top that looks like, if you can read it, I know not all of you can read Rashi script, but it says bid-mashi. And it's a noun of some sort, and it keeps reappearing, and I have no idea what it is, and it's driving me crazy. So yes. Oh, okay, that's fine. I'll be done. Okay. I thought you were going to answer my questions, V. You disappointed me. In any case, okay, so the book's title and the chapter titles are given in proper Hebrew, maybe reflecting the hierarchy of languages in which Hebrew is more authoritative. And most of the culturally specific details are omitted. And then there are foreign terms that are just transliterated and explained. Okay, so we'll come back to the Arabic, but let me read you the English and Hebrew translations for comparison. So how does the novel begin in the English translation, which is very literal to the French? It starts like this. It was on a cold and rainy night towards the end of October 1838 that a tall and powerful man with an old broad-brimmed straw hat upon his head and clad in a blue cotton carter's frock, which hung loosely over trousers of the same material, crossed the Pont au Change and darted with a hasty step into the Cité, that labyrinth of obscure, narrow, and winding streets which extends from the Palais de Justice to the Notre Dame. Okay, so all of it is one sentence. Now, the Hebrew version that Twain is translating from, look at where the red arrow is, reads Bishnat 1800, בשנת 1838, ב-13 יום לחודש התשיעי בערב, להתחולל רוח סערה, ומטר סוחף ניתח ארצה, הולך הלך איש רם הקומה ולבוש קרעים. And it continues, וישים פעמיו אל רובע העיר פריז הנקרא בשם סיטה. הרובע הזה ישתרע מבית המשפט ויפגע בבית תפילת נוטרדאם. So this means in the year 1838, on the 13th day of the 9th month, one evening, a stormy wind broke out and driving rain poured down. A tall man dressed in tatters started walking and made his way toward the quarter of the city of Paris known as Cité. Okay, so notice how much it's simplified and how much detail is lost. And also it's changed because the translator gives this tall man torn clothes rather than some kind of blue frock, okay? So now let's go back to Twaina. Okay, and you can see that the title here is Beit HaMarzeach, which he takes directly from Schulman. That's his translation of Tapis Franc. Okay, so it's like a house of revelry. So I wasn't able to get every word, but here's what I can make out is something like El-Hal, Meken, Wasamunu Nes, maybe that's Lodge. It has two gimels, but I think it's maybe supposed to be Lodge. And then there's that thing I can't figure out, Wabadameshi or Damshe or something. Fihal Ism Wahua Mithl Hotel. Alladhi ينجمعون ويسكرون ويأكلون وينامون بجوع وجميعهم ناس الماء ينفعون هن الرجال هن نسوان الذي كانوا مسجونون بالحبس وتلعوا. Okay, so, and then 5 lines down from the top of the paragraph, right after it says, في بلد باريس, there's something like أهل البوليس يجؤون يدورون بحال مكان. So in the second paragraph, the story proper begins, and this is where you can start to compare it to the English and the Hebrew. Okay, and it says, Bisena, and 1838, just say it in English, Bitlat sar yom lesahar kislev bilemse ab, hawa jara wa matar kawi wazaj, something, right? And then at the second line of the second paragraph, a few words from the end, it says, Wahed rajal awil, hawesu mukata'a, sorry? Oh, okay. Where is that? Oh, you're right. You're correct. Tawil, yes, I'm sorry. Okay. Rahed Vujel Tawil, Wasimukata ala Bidnu. Okay, so it's the tall man on whose body were tattered clothes. So you notice that the original makes him out to be tall and powerful, but by the time we get to Twaina's translation, he's just wearing rags, right? It's like he's following the, I'll be done. I have one more page. Okay. Okay, so he continues, ودخل في رستة الذي اسمها حسيتة الذي هو صوب البوليس, or the man went into the rasta they call the cité, which is the quarter of the police. Now, rasta, I thought, what is this? This is not Arabic, so I had a hunch it might be Hindi, and sure enough, this is Hindi for road or approach. Okay, so basically just in this small section, we've seen how he gives the essence of the story. And notice that Twaina leaves out the courthouse and Notre Dame, right? You're getting even less detail than you got in the Hebrew. Okay, so just in the 2 minutes remaining, I'm going to very briefly touch on the other European novel, Emek Arzim, which he translated in 1895, and I promise I have 1.5 pages left, so I will finish on time, but I'm going to discuss this. So this is from Avraham Shalom Friedberg's 1875 Hebrew translation of the same novel. Okay, now the interesting thing here is that the original novel, in this case, was written in English. This is an adaptation of the Victorian Sephardi writer Grace Aguilar's masterpiece, The Veil of Cedars, or The Martyr, which is a historical romance written in the Gothic mode, originally in 1834, published after her death in 1850, and it's set during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. The novel follows Marie, the titular martyr, as she rejects a Christian suitor named Stanley and marries a Jewish man of her father's choosing. When her husband is murdered, Stanley is wrongly charged with the crime. So to save him, Marie must admit that she is a Jew, but in admitting that, she endangers not only her own life, but also this community of crypto-Jews that are hiding out in a veil of cedar trees, hence the title. And Yuval, this is also the Al-Andalus Baghdad connection here, right? Okay, by the time he translates it. So the Hebrew translator of this one, Friedberg, essentially wrote a new work that was inspired by her novel. So again, it's an adaptation. And he writes, בעקבות העברייה המחוללה בסופרי אנגליה, and then in misspelled English, Miss 1S Grace Aguilar. Okay, so I'm going to skip the Hebrew. So going to Twena, his version appears to be a close translation of Friedberg's Hebrew, and he actually attributes it to Friedberg without even mentioning Aguilar. And the title page is written in Hebrew and reads, Sefer Emek Arazim Chelek Aleph V'Chelek Bet, Mirashit Darkei HaInquisitzia B'Sfarad Im Nosafot Harbe Mekorot Ha'et Hahi Mi'et Aleph Shin Friedberg. And then something about Uva'et Yetza Otek Meturgam B'Loshon Ha'aravi Hanahug. This is where I got confused because it says Lahodia, but I was wondering if that's supposed to be Hodi. Lador et Suk Ha'atid Asher Hayu Ba'avotenu Milfanim U'Baruch Meshanei Eitim U'Machlif Hazmanim. And so on and so forth. So the important point for our purposes is that he identifies his language of translation as Arabic. And as far as the content goes, as far as I can tell, it's a fairly literal translation of the Hebrew. Okay, so in conclusion, what can we take away from these multiple rewritings and translations? And what I'm curious about is the rationale behind Twena's selection choices. Why did he pick these works? Did they reflect his personal tastes or his view of his readers' tastes? Did he translate these works to improve his newspaper's sales, to introduce his readers to modern fiction, or just because he felt like it? Maybe just his own enjoyment. Was it part of a commitment to the goals of the Haskalah movement? I also wonder if his audience, given their location in the British Empire, and they knew English, right? Like, why couldn't they have simply read the original of Aguilar's novel? So why did he need to translate it into Arabic at all? We can only speculate as to these answers, but maybe we can think through it in the discussion. In any case, Twena displays an obvious commitment to adapt these texts to the cultural norms of his readers, from his use of English and Hindi words like police and rasta, to the religious scaffolding and praise of God that appears on the title pages. And more than that, the translation histories of these novels shows us just how global the 19th century world had already become, not only economically, but also culturally. Thank you.